I'm going to resume. And so NEARS is based in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and we support first a nuclear-free, carbon-free, sustainable energy future, a democratically based energy system in which communities are empowered to make decisions about their energy future and their energy sources. We're committed to environmental justice, as well as a just transition that addresses the needs of communities during the progression from nuclear energy and fossil fuels to renewable energy. And then we also work to prevent and protect individuals and communities from exposure to radiation. So that's sort of the scope of the work that NEARS does. I just wanted to give folks a background on that. And so I'm gonna do my very best to break down what's happening in Washington, D.C. around nuclear bailouts and the infrastructure package. And I'm going to start from sort of a high level Biden administration, White House level, and then we're going to get into some of the details of the bills. And so just to start, the Biden administration has made some tremendous promises and commitments to economic recovery, climate action, and justice throughout the campaign, throughout the early days of his administration, and has stated many times that economic recovery, climate action, and environmental justice are key parts of his platform and key parts of his policy priorities. And so this is fantastic to hear, and it's our job to hold him accountable to these promises and to make sure that the policies that he is pursuing connect with, there's not a disconnect between the policies that he's pursuing and these promises that he's made. And so these promises can be seen in the White House fact sheets around the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, which are some large ideas and plans about infrastructure specifically, which is a very broad thing. And so the administration, by creating these American Jobs and Families Plans and making these promises, has tasked Congress with creating some major legislation around infrastructure. And so I'm going to start kind of, again, high level, talking about the two different infrastructure bills, and then we're going to get into the details on what each of these bills has for nuclear. And so there are two different bills and they have two different processes. And if you are lost already, that's okay, because there was an NPR article last week that said things are really confusing, and it's not just you. So again, there's two different bills that are being pursued around this infrastructure legislation. And so the first one is the bipartisan bill, or BIF, which the number is HR 3684. And the bipartisan bill is, like it says, bipartisan. They're working with Democrats and Republicans to pass this. And in fact, it did get passed in the Senate last Monday. And this is a $1.2 trillion amount for infrastructure, from broadband to water to pipes to roads and bridges, as well as to energy and nuclear and some other things. So the bipartisan bill, again, passed and is now being sent to the House, but the House won't see it and won't look at that bill until they get the reconciliation bill. And so I'm going to move now to the reconciliation bill and try to explain the difference between these two. The reconciliation package is very similar in topic. It's also infrastructure, it's also energy, it's also roads and bridges and pipes and water and internet and all of these infrastructure things that are hot topics right now. It's a much bigger. It's a $3.5 trillion package. And the reason why it's separate from the bipartisan bill is because the Democrats are attempting to pass it through the Senate through a process called budget reconciliation, which would not require any Republican votes and would only require a tie-breaking vote. Well, it would require all 50 Democrats to vote yes, as well as as Vice President Harris to vote yes to break the tie. And so this is the Democrats only bill. It's through this process called budget reconciliation, which is why it's called the reconciliation package. It's 3.5 trillion, and it has a whole lot of stuff in it. And it's through this sort of this process that's meant to bypass the Senate filibuster and take advantage of the Senate even split right now and the Democrats' advantage. Are you with me? Can I throw any thumbs up? Any thumbs down on some of this? Great, seeing some thumbs up. And so, but that's before we get into any of the nuclear stuff. This is just what's happening in Washington around the infrastructure bills. And so I want to jump now into, well, before we dive into like the nuclear bailouts, I do want to pause and say that these infrastructure bills are an immensely historic opportunity for us to build a thriving, just, and equitable clean energy economy and finally put the US on the path to fight climate change with ambition, with scale, with funds and resources, and a commitment to justice that we need. A lot of the promises that the Biden administration have made are really, really promising and really progressive, you know, and so it's very, there's a lot of promise and opportunity in this moment as we are shaping the infrastructure bills, and it's up to us to make sure that it fulfills these promises. And so again, the American Jobs Plan promises to transform our energy system to 100% clean energy by 2035 and create millions of jobs to do it and do it equitably, fairly, with justice in mind. And so that's a really good thing. It's a really big thing. And I'm just want us to keep that in mind as sort of the overall purpose of these infrastructure bills as we dive into some of the things that we don't like, that we'd like to be taken out of the infrastructure bill and replaced with things that would accomplish these goals much better. And so let's jump into the nuclear bailouts. There are nuclear bailouts in both the bipartisan bill and the reconciliation package. And I'm going to do my best to explain both of the different types of bailouts and how much and what they mean and how much they would cost. And so I'm going to start with the bipartisan bill, which again is the smaller bill. The total is 1.2 trillion passed in the Senate, HR 3684. And so the bipartisan bill includes a total of $6 billion over 5 years for a civil nuclear credit program. And so under this program, unprofitable reactors that would otherwise close can apply for credits, which the Department of Energy would award to all which would qualify. And so the cost of this program for the next 5 years is capped at $6 billion, which is a pretty big cap. But the bill does include the possibility of extending the program an additional 5 years through 2031. In that case, the total cost would be $12 billion over 10 years. But currently what's allocated in this period, the 5-year period, is $6 billion for the civil nuclear credit program. And I'm not sure if anyone here is from West Virginia, but this bill was brought forward by Senator Manchin. And so bipartisan bill would prevent reactors from closing. One other important piece of the bipartisan bill is that there's a caveat that it would give preference to reactors that use domestic uranium as fuel. And so not only would this incentivize reactors that are not profitable, that again would otherwise close, that are not economical, but would also subsidize and incentivize domestic uranium production, milling, mining, processing, and transportation all across the country. So that's there's sort of a handout to domestic uranium industry in this as well. And so with that, I'm going to transition over to the reconciliation package, but first I'm going to just take a glimpse at the chat. Cool. And yeah, there's a question about the reconciliation bill, and I can do my best to explain that, and we can share some resources as well. And so the reason why it's called reconciliation is because it's through this process called budget reconciliation. Basically, because they don't want to, they want to pass this process without using any Republican votes in the Senate because of the even split. This would be they wouldn't be adding anything to the overall congressional budget. They would be breaking even. And so it's a reconciliation of sort of a new allocation of the budget. And so they're actually planning on paying for it. Let me just pull this up quickly so I don't say it incorrectly. The Senate Democrats have agreed to a $3.5 trillion bill to fund this infrastructure package called the reconciliation package, and they would raise funds for this by increasing the minimum income tax rates on corporations and very wealthy people. And so that's how they would raise the money, and this is what they would spend it on, so it would all sort of come out to even, and they wouldn't have to change the overall budget, which is why it's called budget reconciliation. And I can go into that a little bit more in depth later, but that's how I understand it, is it's sort of a winding process to bypass some partisan stuff. And so in the reconciliation package, which there's a bill in it, or proposed to be in it, called the Zero Emission Nuclear Power Production Credit Act of 2021. And this bill does not contain a firm cost cap, but we can estimate the total cost. The bill would provide a tax credit to eligible nuclear power plants for 10 years. So this is the period of 2022 to 2031. And this would reduce the taxes they owe based on the amount of electricity they would generate in that time. And so all merchant reactors across the country would qualify, merchant nuclear power plants would qualify for the tax credit, which again is called the production tax credit. And just to give a definition of a merchant reactor, merchant power plants are owned by companies that sell their electricity through competitive markets or directly to customers through contracts, as opposed to utility-owned reactors, which recover their costs through electricity rates approved by the state government. And so the tax credits would provide $15 per megawatt hour, and NEARS did some calculations where we assessed which reactors would qualify under the definition given in this bill and figured out, how much electricity they generate, where they are in the states, how many exist, and at the rate we calculated, the total cost of the bailout would be $4.6 billion per year for 10 years, or a total of $45.6 billion over the 10-year period. So those are the two different bailouts and the two different amounts that are being proposed. There is a chance that both of these will be passed, that both nuclear bailouts will be included in the bipartisan bill and the reconciliation package, which would result in the nuclear industry kind of getting a double bailout. We don't really know how the two different production tax credit and the civil nuclear credit program, how the two bailouts would interact with each other, or how they would interact with state bailouts that are already passed, these state bailout programs or subsidy programs that are already in action. So there is definitely a lot of unanswered questions about how this would work. And we hope that with our public pressure and grassroots efforts, we can prevent these from being passed in the first place, so we don't have to worry about that. And then Again, I'm going to reiterate the status of these bills, just where they are at in the process. There is, some limited information, but basically the bipartisan bill passed in the Senate on Monday is heading to the House, but Pelosi won't hold a vote on the bipartisan bill until the reconciliation package also gets passed through the Senate and lands in the House. She will only look at them together rather than one or the other. And so last week, the reconciliation budget was passed, which means that the total amount, 3.5 trillion, was passed, but what actually those funds will be allocated towards is now in committee. And so the Senate committees have their marching orders and are working, I think, through September 15th to negotiate where the money goes. And then they'll come back together and probably do a lot of more negotiation and hold a vote is what I'm thinking. So we have some weeks between now and then to really build public pressure and influence this process. And then before I move on, we are really focused on the nuclear bailouts on this call. And right now that's one of the big focuses of NEARS's work and our network. But I do want to mention there's a lot of other things in these infrastructure bills that probably other groups that you're associated with or follow are talking about. So there's things like broadband infrastructure, water, energy systems like transmission lines, lead pipes, roads and bridges, sort of those traditional like transportation infrastructure. But there is other nuclear stuff in there. And so that includes some funding for research on reactor demonstration projects and research and development on so-called advanced reactors, small modular reactors, and micro reactors. There is money here and there for those things as well. So the bailouts are not the only thing that the anti-nuclear movement is trying to influence in here, but today we're going to focus on the bailouts, but we hope to get more information out to you all soon regarding some of the new nuclear provisions in this. I'm going to look at the chat quickly. Great. Okay. And so, there's a lot of reasons why we are opposed to the nuclear bailouts. And I'm going to share with you some of our talking points now, sort of the broad strokes, but we will share some more in-depth talking points for you all related to these 4 themes. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is environmental justice. And, if these reactors get subsidized and continue to operate versus be decommissioned and close and shut down, more and more nuclear waste will be generated. And that's sort of the key to the environmental justice issues. We all know that nuclear waste creates, or nuclear power creates extreme, toxic, long-lasting radioactive waste, and nuclear reactor waste has nowhere to go currently. There's no permanent solution for it. And so as we continue to, I'm just checking the chat quickly. There we go. Yeah, so there's more information on the cost in the chat here. But one of the main things that we're pointing to as why nuclear subsidies in the American Jobs and Families Plan does not accomplish the justice goals of the Biden administration is that the White House created an environmental justice advisory council, and they recommended against nuclear power projects and cited that nuclear power is not a benefit to environmental justice communities. And so the White House's own environmental justice advisory committee is recommending against nuclear, and yet in the White House's plans, it includes these subsidies for nuclear power. And so that's a pretty key piece of why we think that some of their, sorry, the chat is distracting me. I need to move that out of the way. why the White House's promises, we can sort of use their words and use their own findings of their own committees and advisory councils to influence this. And so again, more information will be headed your way around environmental injustice, but that's one of the main themes that we are using to communicate out about this. And we have action alerts related to all 4 of these. And then I'm going to move to climate change. This is one of the big topics with the Biden administration, and one of the main reasons why the false solution of nuclear power comes up to solve climate change. And the bottom line is current proposals for bailing out nuclear power are predicated on this very false notion that nuclear power is clean. And we also know that the nuclear power industry and its government allies spend a lot of money annually to promote atomic power as emissions free, when in fact, building nuclear power plants is not emissions free. The transportation, there's a lot of emissions related to nuclear power plant operation, in addition to radioactive waste that gets generated, which is under no definition is that clean. And so what we are trying to communicate to elected leaders is that not only do these nuclear bailouts fail to address the climate crisis because they would not take any amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They don't create any new power at all, any new clean energy. They just sustain the status quo. But we are spending $50 billion, $46.5 billion that could otherwise be spent on real climate solutions. And so these bailouts would steal away resources needed to actually curb emissions and actually build a clean, reliable, renewable energy future. And so there's a big opportunity cost with investing in nuclear versus investing in renewables. And then the economics angle is another big piece. And we had a report come out a couple weeks ago by Dr. Mark Cooper that outlines why these nuclear bailouts are pretty ineffective for economic growth and prosperity. And we found that these bailouts would not actually create a single new job. And in fact, if that money was spent on creating a renewable energy system, it would create over 60,000 new high-paying, family-supporting green jobs. And so there's a huge cost, job cost to spending money on these reactors versus, again, creating new jobs, new power generation with clean sources. And so we will, again, share these talking points a little bit more in depth. And then finally, our final angle is to track and follow some of the money. And we discovered that when we did our calculations on which corporations and which reactors would end up receiving the money, the $50 billion, we had some good findings where over 35 billion would go to just 3 corporations, Exelon, Energy Harbor, and PSEG. And all 3 of these companies we found have been lobbying for subsidies. And in fact, Exelon and Energy Harbor are currently the subjects of federal corruption cases over billion-dollar nuclear subsidies for which they lobbied in Illinois and Ohio. And so it's really suspicious and really dangerous for these federal funds to be going to directly to these companies that are already under federal investigation for bribery and corruption scandals. And this could just contribute to those scandals. And so we have more information on our blog, much more information. I'm kind of giving you the broad strokes and how I understand it. But I hope that you take a look and follow the money with us on our blog for that. And so I'm going to check the chat real quick. Julie asked why no new jobs from nukes, and I do want to answer that question. Well, the bailouts would, these bailouts would only go to reactors that are currently operating. They're already staffed. This isn't building any new, anything new. This would, at best, sustain a few thousand jobs. However, there's no provisions in these bailouts that means that these reactor companies would need to either hire new people or even retain the employees they have. And there have been lots of instances of reactors and nuclear companies that receive bailouts that then continue to cut jobs. So actually we could lose jobs from this. So this does not create any new jobs. It may sustain a few thousand, but only temporarily. And actually the best thing for nuclear workers would be decommissioning, because nuclear companies have billions of dollars already set aside for decommissioning tasks, which would keep their employees working on decommissioning for decades. And this money is already set aside. They already have trust funds that would cover the costs of that. So it would sustain these same jobs. It would sustain about half of the nuclear employees currently for decades at no cost to the taxpayer, because the companies already have funds for that. Hope that answers your question. All right, we're going to jump to taking action. So we have a list here of all of the ways that we're recommending that you get involved and take action. And I'm going to go through them, and then we're going to break into breakout rooms and talk about them a little bit more in depth. So first, many of you have already written or called your elected leaders, and I would just encourage you to continue doing that. And if you have not called or written your elected leaders, that is number one. That's the first item of action that I would recommend you do, is write a letter, write an email, or even just pick up the phone and call the staff of your senators and reps in Washington, your federal representatives, and tell them to oppose these nuclear bailouts and instead invest in 100% renewable energy. And NEARS has a platform where you can do that just in a few clicks, and we will be sharing that with you, I think in the chat, but also in a follow-up email that you'll be receiving. We also recommend that when you write or call your elected leaders, you draw from your own experiences. You talk about if you live in a reactor community, if you live near a waste site. But like I said, these subsidies would be going to just a very small amount of communities, but would be your taxpayer dollars. And so investing those taxpayer dollars in other communities or renewable energy infrastructure across the country would go a lot further and would actually benefit folks who don't live near these reactors. And so if you've already written a letter to your elected officials or called them, even if you haven't, I would also recommend that you write a letter to the editor of your local paper. Writing a letter to your local paper is a really good way to influence public opinion, to comment on current events, and to raise awareness. And again, if you can focus on some of the stories from your own community, from your fears about having nuclear waste coming to you, or your fears about keeping open uneconomical and dangerous and dirty and aging nuclear reactors near you. These sorts of stories really can resonate. Or if you're outraged about the corruption scandals of Exelon and First Energy, this is a really good forum to raise awareness and share that outrage and encourage people in your community to take action as well. And I would be happy to sit down with anybody on the call and brainstorm ways for you to, talking points, or help write this, or provide any information or data that would be helpful. But we also have a letter to the editor guide that we'll be sending out to everybody. Third, we have attending an in-person or virtual event, and congratulations, you are all attending a virtual event right now. Thank you so much. But this is the place where I want to talk about the Senate recess. And so for the next 6 weeks, senators and reps will be taking recess from Washington, D.C., and many of them spend this time in district doing events, meeting people, campaigning, fundraising, and many times there are some sort of public events where they do meet and greets or town halls or presentations or try and meet constituents. And so what you can do is you can call them up or look on their website and find out where they're going to be. And if they're going to be holding a virtual event or an in-person event, I really encourage you to attend and bring up the nuclear bailouts. And what we'll do is we're going to share the background that I have here. We can thrive without nuclear power, and you can have that as your own background, and you can have a big group and you can all show up on a Zoom meeting, or you can print it out and show up to a meeting in person and show the leader and the staff how opposed you are to nuclear subsidies. And we'll talk more about that and send some resources. And then some of the more obvious ones that you can do anytime are sharing information on social media or email. We will be sharing some posts for you to use, some graphics that you can just share in your own circles and spread the word, talk to your friends, family, and community. You don't have to ruin brunch by bringing this up, but if you have, if it's relevant to a work meeting or a conversation that you're having about climate change, because how can we not all be having conversations about climate change with smoke in the air and tropical storms and flooding and heat waves and all this stuff happening this summer. This is a really good way to influence your community, is having these more small group conversations where you encourage people to take action and spread information. So with that, we're going to move to breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good breakout session. We have a few minutes, and then I have just a couple items for wrap up. But before we do that, I want to give anybody the opportunity to share what they talked about in their breakout room, any actions you plan to take or anything you needed to succeed.
Hannah?
Yes, Sue.
In our breakout session, right at the end, we were talking about Tim Judson's talk this afternoon that I heard for United Methodist Women.
Mm-hmm.
He showed graphs, and one of the graphs was a breakdown of where our energy comes from. And I don't know if you can put that up on the NIRS site so we could make a copy of it, but several of the people in our group wanted to know if there was a poster that showed that, because they thought that they could use that in what they sent or discussed with their congressman.
That's great follow-up. I will connect with Tim and see if I can get that on the NIRS site or send it around, or at least get his presentation so I can pull from that.
Yeah, that'd be great if you could send it to us and so we could copy it. Yeah, that would be wonderful. Okay.
Yeah.
Hannah, this is Stephen Sondheim. I was in the same group. The dilemma for me and for so much of the public is climate change. They've perpetrated the myth that we need nuclear for climate change. And everybody's so afraid. So I think that's the crux. We need, and I like the thrive mentality. We have to show that we can do it without nuclear. Not only do we attack the nuclear problems, but we have to show that it would be a thriving cornucopia of, anyway, the resources are there. And that if you talk to the guy on the street, even the good environmentalists, they buy the Kool-Aid that we've got to attack climate change, which we do, but not in that way. Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to just second that and say if we could have any resources that would help us to know how to answer that question, to say, here's how the nuclear, the green research and the green options can truly function. Like, what do we say when they say, but what do we do in winter and what do we do? I know my thing I would say is, well, they've got a lot more green in Seattle where it rains all the time than we do here. They have got a lot more green in Germany than we do here, and they're surviving on green. No nukes in Germany now. So why can't we do it here where the sun is shining all the time? But I don't know the specifics.
I'd like
Anna?
to.
All right.
There's another thing that Tim showed us today, was a chart that showed the kilowatt hour for solar, the kilowatt hour for wind, and the kilowatt hour for a nuclear plant. And it's 5 times or 6 times more than solar and wind per kilowatt hour.
The cost or the carbon emission?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
The cost and the cost and the carbon emissions. Yeah.
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 Any thermal plant, coal or nuclear, is only about 35% efficient at best. The 75 or 65% is waste heat that just heats the planet.
We've got a comment from Alfred.
Yes, I'd like to say that while the climate change is so important, I do believe that the sales pitch, the advertising pitch that nuclear is the answer to climate change, in fact, is a total cover story and is not at all what the real issue that we're dealing with here is. What we really are dealing with here is the fact that civilian nuclear power is an essential enabler of nuclear weapons. And I'm using ex-Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz's words, the title of his report in 2017, that we have to have nuclear power in order to make nuclear weapons. And if they happen to make, electricity, I mean, so they give us this hoopla about carbon-free and stuff, and I believe it's a cover story. We have to be able to argue that why it's feasible. I mean, but that's the vested interest. The reason we haven't gone green is the vested interests have control. It's the oil and the gas, but the nuclear part is nuclear weapons. That's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Thanks, Alfred. Can everyone still see my screen? I know I kind of moved some things around. You can see my slides and not yourselves, right? Good. So I'm just going to go through our final slides. And then we can continue discussion, or people need to move on, they can do that. I know it's late on the East Coast. So I just wanted to give you a list of the things that you will be receiving from NEARS via email after the session. And so you'll receive our fact sheets around the bailouts. You'll receive our letter to the editor guide, which has some prompts and tips and other talking points and things. You'll receive the action links to all of our alerts that you can either fill out if you haven't done that yet. And so we have different ones for justice, climate, jobs, economics, and corruption. We have all those themes have different alerts. And so those are for you to share or to use. We'll send out some graphics that you can utilize. Either you can change your profile picture, you can share it, or you can email it, as well as the Zoom background that I'm using and a couple other ones that emphasize jobs, that emphasize climate, as well as some social media and email templates so that you can just copy and paste things. You don't have to write it up yourself. You can take our template and adjust it as you need it. So we'll send all that out to you for use. And I do want to flag that we are planning a day of action. We don't have the date set yet, but you will get that information. And we're hoping that everybody can post things, make some calls on that day of action. You'll get more information to come. But all of that, this packet of info will be useful for that and for all of the organizing that we're going to do to come. And then finally, a couple more items. I got a plug that you can follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, and Facebook. If you're connected with those social media platforms, follow NEARS or NEARSnet. I want to model the t-shirts that we have a merchandise store, and put that link in the chat so you can all buy a shirt that says nuclear phase out, not bailout. I'm actually wearing one of the shirts, and so is Anne. And so I don't have a very good like angle on the shirt on my Zoom camera, so I'm not going to like back up into the like abyss of my virtual background, but you can find all of the great merchandise on our store. And that directly supports our work. It's a good way to make a donation as well as get a t-shirt, and you can wear that around, and that's free advertising for us too. So, and then finally, we have a podcast we just launched. You can find it on Spotify, on SoundCloud, on Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts. It's called the Green World Podcast. We have one episode out with interview with me and Tim. So please subscribe, find that if you are a podcast listener, and we'll be diving more in depth on the nuclear bailout in the next couple of episodes.
Thank you, Hannah. It was great.
Thank you. And then with that, here's one of the virtual backgrounds. It's kind of blurry. Another one, and then this is mine. So with that, presentation's done. I see some hands raised, and so I can hang out for a little bit and we can have some more discussion, maybe for about 5 minutes, and then we'll let everyone move on with their evening. Diane, you're muted. Diane, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. I think a person would know that by now. Sorry to be late. I had a conflicting call, but it got over in time. One of the people earlier on said something about how to take on the climate change thing. And so, yes, we need to get details and numbers and all of that. But I think the best way to take that on is to say that nuclear makes climate change worse. Don't fight about if you need it or not. It actually makes it worse because it steals the resources that are needed, as evidenced by these bills in Congress right now. And it's dirty, dangerous, expensive. I really feel like when they do that climate change thing, we need to be very clear that it's the exact opposite. That's my input. Thanks.
And I've got a hand from Sheila and Dennis. Sheila.
Also muted.
And maybe a setting I also did when I set the meeting up. So Sheila, looks like you're not muted now. We can hear you.
Okay. I put it in the chat earlier, but I think I've never had a letter to the editor published in the last 30 years. However, I think there was an editorial in the New York Times last week, or a couple of days ago, that they said we have to fight climate change and we need nuclear to do it. They were very enthusiastic, calling nuclear clean. So I think the leadership of NERSC has to either get an op-ed article or a letter to the editor, with the people in leadership to challenge that thing of nuclear as clean energy and how it takes the resources away from real renewables. And I think that should be as soon as possible, because the editorial was fairly recently, and it was part of the New York Times saying how important it is to fight climate change. And they were very enthusiastic about including nuclear. So that's my recommendation. Aside from us calling our representatives and, writing letters, I really think you need, something more high-powered with more credentials behind it.
Thank you,
And
Sheila.
as soon as possible.
Yeah. Dennis, you have your hand up?
Yes, I just wanted to point out that the solution to climate change is distributed generation. It's not central generation. And so both nuclear and fossil fuel coal are huge central plants that make electricity for perhaps millions of customers each. And the real solution is to have generators everywhere, all connected by a smart grid.
Great. Thank you for that. And then we have Stephen and Laura, and then I think we're gonna say goodnight. Stephen, is your hand still up? Oh, no.
It was before. It was the
Okay.
comment of how you fight climate change.
Great. And then so Laura.
Hi, everyone. I got my time zone wrong. I looked at the converter and it said Pacific time, 5 p.m. to your mountain time, 6 p.m. This has happened before. I don't know quite what I'm doing wrong. Anyway, sorry to have missed the meeting, essentially. But I look forward to the recording, and I know other people are interested. I live downwind of the Hanford nuclear weapons site, and I went there last week with an artist friend to participate in a couple of commemorations in Richland, which is basically the community, the town for Hanford. And both the county that Richland's in, Benton County, and Franklin County next to it have soaring COVID rates. And one of the things that frightens me about that is that Hanford is a place that needs a lot of attention. So it doesn't work when workers can't go to work to minister to that waste. The waste is a big deal for me, and I think partly it's from living near Hanford. So I think one of the things to put out is that during this time of COVID, nuclear really doesn't work if you think about all of the wastes that need to be monitored and cared for, and they're everywhere. Also this summer, we have a couple of uranium mines in Oregon, older, smaller mines that did feed Hanford a little bit, but they weren't considered profitable enough. But they still exist, and they're still not cleaned up. And one of the wildfires here, the bootleg fire, came within 14 miles of those mines in Lake County, Central Oregon. And that's horrifying, So I think, the waste is something that these pro-nuclear people never include. And I just think it's something to really hammer on, especially during a time of COVID. My God. Not to mention people with weakened immune systems who have been downwinders from places like Hanford who are even more imperiled during this time. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Laura. I think that's a really important point, and something to keep in mind as we take action. I think we're providing virtual and in-person tools for whatever people's comfort levels are, and hopefully we can all stay safe in this new wave. So I do really appreciate that point, and I think that that those talking points and those connections are really important for us to weave in, and to just re-emphasize as we are talking about nuclear waste and nuclear power and resilience on our energy system and our healthcare system. So with that, I'm gonna say, I think this was really, really helpful for me. It was so good to see you all and to connect with folks across the country on this, and look out for all the resources we'll be sending your way. And we just really appreciate your time tonight. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate you've inspired me to contact people locally.
Glad to hear it. All right. Good night, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Night.
Good night. Thank you.